All right. So I've been threatening to make, these videos for a while, and I keep putting it off, putting it off. So I realize it's time to get some of these up. I always get intimidated because I know these are going to be permanent, or at least semi-permanent. So I always hesitate to put these together. So as I keep saying, I'd like to do a series of short, hopefully short lectures, talks on various topics about crime, and building up to again to the 90s. So the theme's kind of looking at crime and popular culture with maybe a special emphasis on California and Hollywood, but looking at various aspects from, say, the 40s all the way up to at least the 90s, but also show how a lot of this stuff is still in our culture today. We've already done a quick talk on Black Dahlia when we met in person, and Black Dahlia very much is a part of today's topic. Let me go ahead and share the screen so you don't have to look at me. You can look at the PowerPoint. And again, this PowerPoint is kind of, I've been tinkering with it all morning, and I finally realized I need to start recording. So I might have to bounce around a little bit to make my points, but I'll try to keep it quick and short. So today we're going to talk about film noir. Basically just simply means dark film. And I'll talk about the origin of that name in just a moment. And it's tough with film noir because in a way, film noir doesn't really exist. And what I mean by that is if you go back to the 30s, 40s, or 50s, for instance, and you talk to filmmakers and actors and writers, they would have a very clear idea what a Western is, or what a comedy is, or what a horror film was. But they wouldn't, first off, they wouldn't even have heard of the term film noir because it's a French term. It didn't make popular culture, make it into popular culture really till, for most people, till the 70s or 80s. But they weren't making film noir movies. They were making primarily, this, what we now call film noir, pretty much mostly crime films. Sometimes they might fall under the title of spy films, maybe even, sometimes suspense films, maybe mysteries, even a few Westerns fit this category, kind of dark romances that today we would label, place under the label film noir. In some of my history classes, I throw out a statement sometimes that, Native Americans or Indians didn't exist until Europeans and Africans arrived. How can that be? And of course, the answer is Native Americans, pre-contact, just thought of themselves as individual groups. They didn't think of themselves as all one big group. We can think about race too. Before people talked about race, no one thought of themselves as part of a race. They just were. Nowadays, we have these labels. And so it wasn't until Europeans showed up that they went, oh, you guys are one thing. You're all Indians or Native Americans. And that's really kind of the case with film noir. These were films that were popular. Some were big Hollywood productions. Some were, in fact, a lot of them were very cheap B movies. And then they did imitate each other. There'd be a popular film and other films would kind of copy it. But they weren't thinking we're making one big type of film of genre. And unlike, say, Westerns, where there was very clear rules that they were following and tropes. It's only after the fact that people go back and go, oh, these are film noir. So that's what I mean by, in a way, it doesn't exist. And one of the biggest things for film fans like me, I personally hate this conversation, but if you read anything about film noir or Facebook groups and things like that, the constant conversation is this a film noir? What is a film noir? Is this film noir? I don't think it is. And they argue, it's like, it kind of doesn't matter. It's really more of a vibe, a feeling. There are, and I'll get into this in a little bit, there are set things that kind of make it film noir, I think. But it's more, again, it's more of a feeling. There's a very famous quote by a Supreme Court Justice that Stuart Potter, who back in the 1960s, there was these obscenity trials, basically about things that, are they pornography? Are they, obscene? And one of these cases went up to the Supreme Court, and the justice said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And which is a pretty darn good definition. I think that's, we talk about terrorism. That's one of those things. You can't really define it. You think you can, but then there's always film noirs like that. Once you try to really define it, it doesn't work. So it's like, it when you see it. And you do see a lot of film noir tropes in our culture today. Some are very direct, like in the video game world, there's games like LA Noir and other types of games that are clearly directly evoking the past. But others, like there's a new Batman movie coming out, and Batman in the superhero world and the comic book world is probably the most noirish character. And of course, he was created back in 1940 during the very, kind of pre-film noir days, and he, they very much took on a lot of the tropes of that period, of the crime fiction of that period. And today they're much more open about the noir elements. A lot of comic books it deal with noir, and we get things that we might call neo-noir, which is really dates back to the 60s all the way till today, although really most of them are a little bit of the 70s, 80s, 90s. But these are films that have that noir feel, but again, they're modern films. And but I think what makes many of these films neo-noir instead of just being modern crime films is that they're usually purposely imitating and evoking these old films. So back in the 40s and 50s, they were current, they were about now. But then later, a lot of filmmakers were making films, even if they were in the present, but they were clearly imitating these older films, and we call these neo-noir. You got, some from the 70s and 80s, but these are things that still come out today. So we still can see this vibe in a lot of modern films. And a lot of people don't even realize that they're evoking these older noir tropes, if you will. And so, there's a lot of debate over when does noir begin. There's a lot of studies of noir. I actually have several books myself about noir films. Some are very serious studies. Others are just more kind of fan fiction. And again, sometimes people have argued that maybe even the study of noir kind of goes beyond the reality, because again, it does talk about them as though these are very purposeful films and many, that's terrible graphic. It looked good when I put it in the paper. I didn't realize how bad a quality that was. But kind of what is noir? Again, mostly they do tend to be crime films. Sometimes the crime element is very upfront. Sometimes it's kind of more in the background. But they're very ambiguous about morals. There's kind of no completely good people. And by the way, every time you start to define it, like I said earlier, it doesn't always work. You can always come up with a million examples why it doesn't work. A lot of times they do have happy endings kind of tacked on at the end, but usually it's much more I think this is one of the reasons they're still popular, because I think they're much more realistic about life, because life is can be very dark. It can be very ambiguous. We all know that we can be great people, but we can also be terrible people. We understand kind of the reality of the world, and we talk about it today. And when we look at mostly older films, which I love, but they tend to not to be quite so upfront. They're much more of a fantasy world. Noir kind of is scratching at the surface of American society and showing you what's really underneath sometimes. James Elroy, the novelist, defined noir as simply when a good man falls in love with a bad woman, which really isn't really the plot of a lot of these movies, but it is the plot of some of them. But what he's trying to get at is, they're not always bad people, but they're people doing bad things, maybe out of jealousy, out of love, out of greed, mistaken identity, fear. And again, there is, as I said, this kind of ambiguous. They tend to be rather dark films, literally, actually the lighting. Some of that's on purpose. And I'll talk about the Maltese Falcon in just a moment, which was a prestige Hollywood production made by John Huston, who's a hot new director at that time, based on a novel that was very popular by Dashiell Hammett. Actually had been made a couple of times already before this particular version, starring a rising actor, older actor though, but a rising actor named Humphrey Bogart. This is really his breakthrough film. So a lot of the style was in this particular film was on purpose, but a lot of these films were cheap films, and lighting is expensive, and sets are expensive. So often they were darkly lit, a lot of shadows to hide the cheapness of the films. But they do tend to they're very stylized often. A lot of use of shadows. Most of them are in black and white, which is why I think a lot of neo-noir doesn't always work quite as good. Once they're in color, to me, it does lose something. Sometimes people talk about femme fatales, the dangerous woman. I think that gets overplayed a little bit, the femme fatale element, although most neo-noir very much always has that element. There is a lot of times a lot of sexuality in many of these films, not all of them, but again, they do deal with topics that aren't always dealt with in films of that era, and sometimes it's coded, but it is there. I mean, drug use, homosexuality, all forms of sexuality, jealousy, a lot of violence, abuse. I mean, again, they're talking about those topics that often weren't talked about by other films, even if it sometimes it is coded. But I guess in essence, I would say these films deal very directly with the duality of humans, if you will. You know, the good and evil in all of us in some cases, even if they, like I said, even if ultimately they have a happy ending. So if you ask most people what is, you know, like what constitutes noir time-wise, the classic answer is 1941 Maltese Falcon, again, based on the Dashiell Hammett novel starring Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor and Peter Lorre. And then for most people, it ends with 1958's Touch of Evil, directed by Orson Welles, starring Charlton Heston and Orson Welles himself. Also Janet Leigh, who did quite a bit of film noir at the time. Both incredible films and both pretty prestige productions, although Touch of Evil was a little cheaper than Maltese Falcon. And so generally in between these two films, it's considered the film noir era. For me personally, I really look at the era right after World War II to about 54, 55. To me, that was really kind of the key area. So where does it get its name? And this is another Orson Welles film, Lady from Shanghai, another classic noir film. Again, it comes from French critics. So, you know, the French, the Germans have always saw films as art in a way that Americans, even today, don't always think of it as art. I say film a lot. It's not, I'm not trying to be snooty. I just say the word film instead of movie a lot of times. And I get picked on by even colleagues of mine. Oh, you're saying film. You can't say movie. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And again, but it kind of reveals that we Americans are really funny about movies. But again, places like Germany and France, they've always considered them art right from the beginning. And so a lot of the earliest film criticism comes out of France. And so they liked American films, where, you know, and then World War II happens. They're taken over by the Germans. Their film industry shuts down in Europe, or just Europe as a whole. Most American films are not making it to Europe. And then the war ends in 45. So by 45, 46, you start getting this just huge amount of American films showing up in France. And the film critics noticed that American films had changed since the war. They were literally darker. And all the things I've already talked about, the ambiguity of people, and they were really surprised because these didn't feel very American. You know, American society, even today, does tend to be very can-do, you know, like, again, as a historian, I can tell you, people are always like, oh, you historians always talking about race, always talking about negativity. Americans don't like that. We want happy endings. We want everything to be positive, especially about us. And so it was unique that these films were rather dark and could be very pessimistic. The French were really shocked at this. And they said, you know, these are very European films in their sensibilities. And so they said they're dark films, they're film noir. And the term eventually caught on. I did a search recently on I have a subscription to newspapers.com, so it has almost all the major newspapers are digitized on it, including for Florida. So just for Florida, I looked up the term film noir and just, you know, and search like the earliest time it appeared. So for Florida, you start seeing it in the early 70s, and mostly on college campuses, film noir film festivals and stuff. So it takes a while for that term to take off. And it's really after these films were done being made that people started talking about them as film noir, but it is a French term. But their focus on that European aspect it's not an accident. If you look back at German films from the 20s and early 30s, like one of my all-time favorites, M, directed by Fritz Lang, which is about a child molester and killer who is then hunted down by other criminals. And that's why he's marked with the letter M for murder, which is how the criminals know who he is. And anyway, this is directed by Fritz Lang, who later made a lot of film noir movies. So these very Germanic, and German films also had, you know, very stylish, and they basically were film noir in Germany. And when Hitler rose to power, what you started seeing is a lot of these filmmakers migrating to the US, people like Fritz Lang and Edgar Ulmer and others, and they're basically bringing that sensibility with them. And a lot of these films in the 20s and early 30s were made during a pretty rough time in German history, major economic depression, a rising crime, a lot of social divisions. And then, post-World War II, America has that to a lesser degree, even though we're doing very well as a nation, but still there was a lot of tensions in the early 50s and late 40s about communism and about juvenile delinquency and racial tensions. And there was an unease about, communism in general and a potential World War III. And so again, it was a time period where the sensibility from the Germans, for instance, people kind of agreed with a little bit. So there is a strong German influence to these, and also a strong French influence, but yet at the same time, a very strong American influence about crime fiction and such. By the way, one of my all-time favorite actors in crime movies is Robert Mitchum, who was, I think, the quintessential, along with Bogart, kind of the quintessential male film noir actor. And as far as actresses, I would go with Ida Lupino, Barbara Stanwyck, and Gloria Graham. You may not know who those are, but if you watch these films, you will learn very quickly. I think the typical film noir plot, and a lot of people consider this to be the best film noir. And by the way, it was a major Hollywood production. And I keep saying that because the story of film noir, they always say these are those cheap films, which is true for a lot of them, but not all of them. And this was a major film. But Double Indemnity, basically you have a private eye working for an insurance company played by Fred McMurray. He's investigating an insurance claim. He meets this beautiful femme fatale. I mean, this is the femme fatale played by Barbara Stanwyck. She's married to a rich old guy. There's an instant lust between, I mean, it's like very, in the movie, it's like they are, again, a good man falling for a bad woman, right? And they have this instant chemical reaction to each other almost, but she also sees this guy as a mark. So she says, look, I hate my husband. I've never loved him. He has a great insurance policy. I forgot the exact detail, but it's like, if he dies on a train, he'll get this amount of money. But if he drowns, he'll get this amount of money. But if both happen at the same time, it's double indemnity. So they hatch a plan to throw him off a train over into a river, and then they're going to split the money and run off together. But of course, he does the murder. She takes the money. She turns him in. She runs off. The movie, spoiler, the whole movie is told in flashback and narrated, which is very typical of film noir. That's often the case. They're often, there's usually a narrator, not usually, but often a narrator that like, I remember when I met her, and they go back. I mean, that's a real trope of film noir. So the whole movie, he's been narrating it. He's recording it, and he's shot. And basically they have killed each other at the end of it, and he's confessing to his crime, and then he dies, and that's how the movie ends. There's no real good person here. They're all flawed, they're all greedy, and even though there's maybe remorse at the end, it's too late at that point. But that is film noir in a nutshell, I think. So if you never watch a film before, this is kind of the classic film to watch. But again, this is in the air at the time. Crime novels were big from the 20s all the way up, especially by the late 40s and 50s. Pulp Fiction is all the rage. Many of these films are based on pulp magazine stories, comic books, novels. Again, if you went to any newsstand, you would see hundreds of true crime magazines, again, aimed at adults, aimed at the typical reader, both men and women. Comic books, which I want to do another little video just about comic books at this period, because it's a kind of a fascinating topic. But crime, horror and crime comics become all the rage. I mean, they sold in the millions, literally. So bad that Congress investigated because of the violence. And you can see some of these comics, I mean, they're pretty rough for the time period. Some of the imagery in these. They were aimed at kids, but very often it was adults that were reading these, and they're very noirish. In fact, a lot of noir is based on these. Even on television, TV shows like Dragnet were noirish, even though it was TV, so a little safer. But again, everywhere you looked in American society from about 47 to about 54, it was about crime. It was about darkness. It does reflect something about that time period. And again, there's literally hundreds of these films that today we refer to as film noir. Some big Hollywood productions, some very, very cheaply made. And some of the best ones are the cheap ones. And again, part of this is coming out of World War II, even though we won and, we celebrated that victory, but men are coming back from that war with a lot of darkness. They've seen and done things that they never thought they could. Families have lost loved ones. They've noticed that their husbands and sons and brothers are different. A lot of these film noir deal with, in fact, I'll go back to this channel, this slide for a moment. A lot of these films talk about this. I mean, they're very open about, and that's something else I want to talk about in another, there's a whole theory about why crime and killing goes up. And some people think it is because of World War II, but that's another topic. It's the Holocaust people realize the Holocaust, and that was done by regular folks. There's a real darkness there. Obviously, this is the time of, the war ended with the doomsday machine. I mean, the atomic bombs is how and America created that, so everyone's hands is dirty with World War II, and people are coming back, and they kind of are seeing American society through eyes that now are in tune with some of the darkness of humans. So there's a reason why civil rights movement develops in the 50s, because people see racism more than they had before. The women's movement begins at this period. Other movements begin at this period because we're kind of a little more honest about ourselves because of that World War II experience, but also because of communism, the fear of we might become communists, which again, what part of that fear is that all of us have it in us to be a communist and take over if we're not careful. Again, that's about duality of people. So, throughout the 50s, people are talking about this. And again, the stakes are real. I mean, the hydrogen bomb has been invented at this point. Something that really could take out all human life. We're involved in a war against communism in the early 50s, the Korean War. And there's a lot of fears, for instance, that communists are going to infiltrate America through brainwashing, through films, through all kinds of things. So again, it really is in the air. And a lot of film are directly about this. It sounds like a silly movie, but it's actually a really good one. I Married a Communist and The Red Menace. And so a lot of these films are very openly about communism. The other big fear at this time, which is also tied in, is the rise of juvenile crime. Which some people saw as a communist plot or would lead to communism. So both Pulp Fiction and films often dealt with this. It's not really film noir, but it's kind of a subset of film noir. And again, as we know, this is sadly the time of rising racial violence, and the most famous, the Emmett Till murder, which there was a lot of outrage over that, which partly led directly to the modern civil rights movement. But again, as some of you know, the killers of Emmett Till got away with it, and then they bragged about it. That's about as noirish as you can get, and these are good folks, good white Southern folks that did that murder, right? Even a lot of directors are playing with this. One of my favorite directors, after Hitchcock, in fact, this is one of my all-time favorite movies, Shadow of a Doubt. I mean, it's a noir film about a murder within a family. Psycho, which is considered sometimes the first modern horror film, it's also noir. I mean, if you look at Through His Eyes, it's all film noir. He's clearly evoking film noir elements. Okay, finally, let's talk about. I'm uploading 2 films today. They're both short and they're both cheap films, but they're both excellent, and they're very great film noir. And again, they're both real quick and they're a lot of fun. The first one is Detour. It's made by a guy named Edward G. Ulmer, who was one of these German immigrants. He was an incredible filmmaker, but he mostly made cheap little films. And so it's only been fairly recently that people have kind of discovered Edgar G. Ulmer, because he did make all these cheap films. He was supposed to, he was a major director. He came to America. He was given a high profile horror film, The Black Cat, which I play in my horror film class. It is bonkers. And it's got necrophilia, it's got incest, it's got devil worship in it, it's got S&M in it. And it came out, but Hollywood was like, you went too far. So he was relegated to the cheap movies after that. And Detour is kind of his masterpiece, in my opinion. It's not the best actor. Tom Neal, the lead actor, is not really good. He kind of has one expression, and this is it. But it's just so well made. But really what makes this movie is the actress Anne Savage, who is a B-movie actress. She only made a few films, but this is it. And once it takes 30 minutes where she shows up, but the movie, that's when the movie takes off. And the moment she's on screen, that's it. It's a totally different film, and it's what makes the film. So got Detour, and the other one is Gun Crazy, which I think Detour is a better film, but this is another bonkers film, but it's also excellent, directed by Joseph Lewis. It's very modern feeling at times. And if you've ever seen Bonnie and Clyde, the classic film from the late 60s, which kind of started modern Hollywood, it's obvious that Mike Nichols, who made that film, knew this film. A lot of the films from the 90s, the Tarantino years and stuff, that they clearly knew about Gun Crazy. In fact, they even remade it. It's terrible, but they remade it in the 90s. But a lot of the films of the 90s, these neo-noir films, are very much doing Gun Crazy. And there's this incredible scene that's a bank robbery. It's all in one shot, and it just looks like something from a recent film. So anyway, those are our two films today. I hope that by talking about some of this, it'll kind of inspire you to maybe watch some other films and maybe do some reading on your own. My all-time favorite film noir, though, even though I say that about every film, but my all-time favorite film noir, and probably my top 5, is a movie called In a Lonely Place with Bogart and Gloria Graham. It's a very different kind of film noir. It is noir, but it's kind of a doomed romance. There is a murder, but it's off screen, but there's always this threat of violence throughout. It's very much about the inability to ever really know somebody else, that we're really kind of trapped in our own skins, and we might have moments of happiness, but it's probably not going to last. But it's a great film, and it's based on a novel by Dorothy Hughes, which is totally different, but it's also excellent. And by the way, as I said earlier, a lot of this crime fiction and movies had a lot of very strong women, both in front of the camera and behind the cameras as well. And there's a lot of good stuff out today. Again, there's a lot of modern noir. In the comic book world, they very much, Fade Out's my favorite, by writer Ed Brubaker and artist Sean Phillips. Oops, I didn't want to go to Kitty Genovese. And if you don't know Ed Brubaker, you've seen some of the Marvel films out there. It was his stories that a lot of those films are based on. All right, that's it for today. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of this another day. So I hope you guys watch. Sorry, I'm switching around here. I hope you guys watch the films, and next time we see each other, we can talk about them. And I might show you, next time we meet, I might show you a couple of clips from some other film noir. But anyway, be on the lookout for another video, but this time on comic books in the 50s. And then we'll talk about people like Kitty Genovese in a later video. Okay, see you guys. Have fun.